Fabulous Jean Tucker asked me to talk a little bit about legislative matters. Probably the most important thing is to understand the dynamics of the House and the Senate. I think I shared this with you last time I spoke with you, but in the Colorado House, the Democrats hold the majority, but in the Senate, the Republicans hold the majority. So that causes really interesting dynamics and really encourages bipartisanship, which is what I think people need and want to see. So in other words, if the House of Representatives passed bills and sent it over to the Senate and the Senate didn't like them, they would just kill the bills. And if the Senate did the same thing to the House, nothing would happen. And so that is not what we saw happen during this last legislative session. We saw Republicans and Democrats coming together in the House and in the Senate to do really good work for the people of Colorado. And I have a couple examples for you. We all worked very carefully in a bipartisan way to pass workforce development legislation. Some of them you'll see in the form of increased funding for the READY grant program, which is the Rural Economic Development Initiative. Also for a program called Rural Jumpstart, and that's an incentive for businesses to locate in rural Colorado with really great tax breaks. Also, working with many of you, we were able to expand the cottage food industry again. And that was a bill that Senator Donovan and Representative Willett and I carried together, worked very closely across the aisle and across the chambers to now be able to have pickled products for sale in the cottage food industry. We also worked very closely on reducing the amount of testing of our students in our K-12 system. Believe it or not, that was the most contentious issue of this entire legislative session. It finally came together on the very wee hours of the legislative session. So I was very pleased to have been involved in that personally as well. But probably the most important thing is that we presented a balanced budget. Many of you know that I was appointed this past year to be the vice chair of the Budget Committee. And actually, when we reconvene on November 12th, I will be appointed the chair of the Budget Committee. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. But so in this year's budget, and well, I should start by telling you about the Budget Committee. The Budget Committee has 6 members, and they're chosen by leadership in the parties and in each chamber, the House and the Senate. So the House gets 3 representatives, and since I mentioned to you the Democrats have the majority in the House, the House Democrats get 2 positions on the Budget Committee and 1 Republican. Since the dynamic is shifted in the Senate gets 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat to serve on the Budget Committee. So, if you do the math, you end up with 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans on the Budget Committee. And for any decision item to be made, for any line item in the budget, there needs to be a majority vote. Aha, that's the kicker. So if each of us dug in with our philosophical points of view, there would be no budget. But let me tell you what we do have in this budget that began July 1. We were able to increase K-12 funding by $209 million. We were able to increase funding for higher education. We heard about the dilemma with student debt. $105 million more for higher education. For the first time in a long time, general fund money will go to transportation infrastructure improvement. $100 million for transportation. We have $126 million built in for senior homestead property tax exemptions. We have 184, see, it's very exciting. $184 million more for the Medicaid caseload increases that we're seeing in the state. We've passed legislation to increase our reserves but to 6.5%, and so we have $613 million set aside in reserves just in case there's a terrible rainy day. We were able to increase by 1.7% the rate increase for social service providers, $7 million to increase the number of child welfare workers, and $7.6 million to increase senior citizen and disabled veteran property tax exemptions. So, I mean, that was a lot, and all of that in a bipartisan kind of fashion. And So as we look ahead, though, even though most parts of the state are thriving, we have $10 billion now in our general fund. Essentially, all of that money is spoken for. So one thing to think about, and one of our biggest challenges, is trying to develop a budget when many of the decision items are in statute or in our state constitution or are driven by budgetary needs that we don't have a lot of flexibility around, like Medicaid, like the mandatory K-12 increase that's required every year for inflation through Amendment 23, like prisons. We can't exactly go and close a prison to save some money. We have people that are serving their time. We have really a lot of restrictions around human services funding. Like I said, we have to have a reserve. We, because of previous legislation, have to transfer $100 million for transportation. And we have hit the Tabor cap. So Millie Hamner is taking over as chair of the Budget Committee at a time when, as you heard from the panel, and at a time when I go out and do these kind of outreach deep dives into my district, I hear from people more. They want more. They want better roads. They want more funding for schools. They want more services for people who have mental health issues or are elderly and disabled. They want more funding for rural health care and medical service providers. So I'm hearing we need more services, but Tabor is holding our hands and is not letting us spend the very revenue coming into the state budget for those growing needs and those issues. It's kind of like I have a little analogy here. Colorado's economy is heading up McClure Pass at about 65 miles per hour, right? Just like me trying to get here on time today. But we've hit the Tabor cap for state government spending. And so our ability to provide services is crawling along in the slow lane with its flashers on. That's kind of the analogy I use. So at a time when we can afford to spend more to provide the best possible education for our kids, improve our roads and bridges, and our economic development beyond the Front Range, which is really seeing the most economic growth, our hands are once again tied by Tabor requiring us to make a refund of a portion of the state taxes that we collect in order to meet these very needs. So it's interesting, I heard Governor Hickenlooper speak last weekend in Crested Butte there was a tourism conference there. And he said, yeah, as a governor, it's really popular to be issuing tax refunds. On average, by the way, $17 per person. And also another interesting thing, there's a recent CSU study about Tabor and the implications of Tabor since it's been implemented. And Colorado, as you know, is the only state in the union that has the restrictions of Tabor. But actually 81% of property owners are paying more taxes as a result of Tabor than they were before it was implemented. And what's happened is many communities, when they see that they can't get the resources from the state, they go to their local tax base. And so the local property taxes have increased because the state budget hasn't filled in some of the needs that local residents want. And people are more likely, it's still difficult, but they're more likely to raise their own local property taxes than pass some kind of state initiative for increased funding. But I thought that was interesting that people on average are paying more taxes now. And the other very alarming thing that's happening as a result of that is places like Delta County that has a difficult time passing local tax initiatives that could help with some of the issues that I found disturbing about not enough textbooks for kids and kids having to pay to take an AP course. Those are really disturbing to me. But the reason it's very difficult to go to the local community here and say, please pay more property taxes so that we can deal with those issues. So what's happened as a result of Tabor and some communities coming together to increase their own local taxes, we've drastically increased the disparity in funding between our school districts. So some are much better equipped to fund some of the issues that you heard about here today than others. So I'm very concerned about that. So the other interesting little twist about Tabor, you heard earlier from Jean about the ballot coming up. There is going to be yet another marijuana tax question as a result of Tabor. And that is, I think 3 years ago, the voters were asked about whether they wanted to have recreational marijuana in Colorado. The voters resoundingly said yes. The next question in front of the voters was, well, okay, is it okay if we tax the industry so that we can regulate it, build schools, and put in health and prevention kinds of programs? And the voters resoundingly said yes. There was a little glitch in the Blue Book. Tabor says that the Blue Book has to estimate the general fund revenue for the state and how this new tax would apply to the general fund revenue. The economy was growing so fast that the Blue Book estimate was short. And so as a result, it triggered an obscure element of Tabor that says, even though the voters approved the tax, you gave them the wrong information in the Blue Book, so you have to refund the money. So, yes, I'm not making this up. So, Proposition BB will be on the ballot this November, and it will ask Coloradans, once again, can we keep the money to regulate recreational marijuana, to help build schools, and to put in place health prevention and education efforts. So please say yes. One more time. So on the horizon, there is optimism, there is hope, even though it's a really interesting budget situation to be in. You'll start hearing about an effort called Build a Better Colorado. I believe they're setting some meetings that'll be coming up in this area in the next month. There is work going on about a possible reform to Tabor in 2016. There are groups that are coming together with that initiative. There's something you'll hear about, it's called the hospital provider fee. And it's kind of hard to explain in a short way, but after the voters approved Referendum C in 2008, whenever that was, after that, the hospitals were really facing a lot of issues covering their costs, especially with increased caseloads in Medicaid, as we heard earlier, and people who came in for services and couldn't pay for them. So we implemented a fee on every hospital bed that we collect. We build it, bring it into the state budget. We use it to leverage federal funding, and then we give it back to the hospitals to help them cover their costs. It counts towards our Tabor cap revenue. Yes, thank you. For some of us, I had to hear it 3 or 4 times to fully understand it, but some of you got that right away. So we are trying to get support for an effort to exempt that fee from being calculated towards the Tabor cap, which would give us $200 million of revenue to deal with and work with, to deal with some of the issues and needs that we have throughout the state. So we're hopeful that we can reach some bipartisan support around that concept, so you'll probably hear more about that. Very positive for me is that Club 20 in their recent meeting passed a resolution in support of that concept. So I think that shows that we're getting the message out and starting to build bipartisan support for that kind of concept. So my commitment is to collect your input, as I always try to do by coming out into the district, keep your interest in my heart and in my mind as I'm making decisions around the budget or any other kind of legislative issue. I think you know that I work hard. I've always worked hard my whole life, and I'll do everything that I can to do the best I can for you. And optimistically, my last comment for you here today is that together we'll come up with what's best for Colorado and its people, and will strike the right balance between the needs of a growing, increasingly prosperous state and our Western tradition of low taxes. So, thank you.